Well, this is a pretty straightforward question this time. You mentioned Sargent working through planes and that there's another approach to working through rounds. Could you perhaps talk more about these two, or is there a video I missed? Much appreciation and thank you for all your efforts. I think I've mentioned the round a number of times. It's Ang talking, and he says, uh, paint from the rounds, not from the planes. I apologize that I don't have the quote in my hand here, but and that's from Jovan. So let's talk about that. But first, let me thank our four donors today. That's Stephen J, Gail S, Karen O, Theodora. I think three of you guys, Theodora C. I think three of you guys are regular now, and I really do find that enormously helpful. I think this is the first time the last month or so that we've been ahead of the game just a little bit, and so it's very much appreciated. Um, and So let's get on with our interesting question. So this is a standard question point. I mean, I'm going to recommend one more time that when you're listening to me, you're listening to someone who's looking, not somebody who's doing this thing from a schooling basis, who's reading it somewhere and then applying it somewhere. I'm looking with my eyes. So when you hear conversations about the planar and the round, if you've been in this field a while, you'll know to be looking at the work and think it through with your eyes. Uh, there's so words are so inadequate for what we're talking about. But let's just talk about the idea of the round, the comment that Ang made that you should paint from the round, that you draw from the round, whatever, and see if we can maybe sort this out in a way, at least the way I have sorted it out thus far, right? I was rather interested the other day in listening to a microbiologist talk about. Somebody said, "Now you have the expertise. You have this thing, fully mastered, don't you?" And she said, "Well, the science is you don't master anything. You may master a level of the data that you're aware of now. You may master that." I thought that was a very wise statement, and we need to think that way too as painters. I'm just offering you what I'm aware of and my reading of it in my own words and all that sort of stuff, and my uses of it. I mean, I think the reason I even talk about it is because I found usefulness, and I'll talk about some of the uses, some of the reasons I do it the way I do it. And I am inclined more to use the round, and I'll show you how that is. But I'm going to try to just show you. Well, let's talk about where this comes from. Ang's, of course, the Raphael guy. He was. He's not a pre-Raphaelite. He's a Raphaelite. Raphael's the god. And so when you see Ang, you're seeing a remarkable adherence to what he considered the great principles that were embodied in the divine Raphael. What makes him divine is still beyond me, but nevertheless, that's the name that goes with the territory. So on the upper left is Perugino, and Perugino was the teacher of Raphael. And I mentioned this guy because at some point or there might have been Ang, I forget who was mentioning it, but he's describing this guy's work and saying that he used basically, I want to say, eggs for heads and things like that. And I've told you before that I found myself not believing that. Possibly partly because when you're young in the field, you don't see things simply enough. You see everything, and you see, in one sense, you see nothing. You don't see the big. You see the multiples. You don't see the unity. You see the pieces. Okay, so but as I said, I was walking down the street one day and watching in the distance some people walking toward me, and three girls side by side. And in that distance, I was looking. There were these three eggs that looked just like Perugino's. So you could take that as a sort of a summary of the mentality of the round. The head is essentially an egg. So it's a simplistic, they use the word the round. But there's another thing about it, which is that when you're modeling a head, and we'll get into that with pictures, when you're modeling a head, you work from the great simplicity and complicate it. And the planar working might suggest something different, starting from maybe complex and trying to get to the simpler unity of all those complex things. And that's what, to me, that's what I found actually problematical in working that way. So let's look at, so this is, and then the foreground though is the one by Ang. Maybe you can see the connection. The painting on the right, that head is a magnificent head. Presumably the Madonna. I don't remember which picture that's a study for, but so there's Perugino, Raphael on the right, and then Ang. So this is Perugino, his paintings. You can see the simplicity of these heads. That is to say, that eggness of them, the neck's a tube, and don't think that I think that way when I'm putting a picture together as much as I understand that as the great form. So when you're talking about forms, Ang used to also say, well, do you make that out of three little forms? We could just as easily make it out of one great one. And so maybe he's talking about, cheeks and foreheads and lots of chins and all sorts of stuff, when in fact it's an egg. That would be one way of interpreting it. And the work, like of Perugino here, suggests a very powerful adherence to the great form, the greatest form you could conceive. And of course, the classically, the tubes in the eggs are the, tubes in the eggs, tubes and balls, whatever. That's the sort of standard. So then Raphael comes along, and you can see him doing the same thing, with the entire anatomy. Now that figure in the top is presumably made out of his head, and so you could be just saying, well, that's a simple approach to making a figure out of your head. Just make tubes and things, and of course get the shapes of, say, the leg, get the shape right, and don't go looking for trouble. In other words, don't go complicating with all trying to figure out every little thing in the leg. And you'll have a decent platform for the figure, just for starters. And of course, you can always complicate it beyond that, and many do. But so you can see it as a strategy for doing imaginative work as well. And then the Fornarina, this is Raphael, portrait, imaginative portrait by Ang of Raphael and his girlfriend, as I understand it. And we just look at it, I guess that's what it looks like. With it, Ang, as usual, distortion, because the head of Raphael twisted off his neck there, but you can see the grand simplicity of the form of the shoulder on the Fornarina and the great egg, the simplicity of the great forms. I'm just saying, get yourself familiar with what I'm talking about. Those are they. And then here's Ang applying it. You can see the great simplicity of these things. He's not going and counting little things at this point. Doesn't mean he couldn't add to whatever extent and degree he wanted to. But you can see the masses of the head have their egginess, this grand simplicity of the form of the skull or whatever else they're revealing with what they conceal. So there's Ang now. And Raphael, one of the things that he seemed to be also doing when he's working imaginatively is he's trying to make up figures, and he's using the tube and egg sort of thing. And that's not something that's standard in Western art or anything like that. It's a kind of a unique thing to Raphael, maybe even informs Ang's thinking about Raphael and what Raphael is saying. This is Harold Speed, and this is out of his book, and this is probably the epitome of what we think of as the planar, and I assume this is what Ang was talking about. There's obviously the evidence you see when you look at, I don't have it here, when you look at the Bargue, I do have it further down. When you look at the Bargue drawings coming out of Jerome, there's evidence that stuff is more planar. Even Ang's own drawings frequently look quite planar. But what I'm saying by planar now is they suggest wooden, sort of chipped off planes, and then you're going to file them down and round them off and all that sort of thing. It sort of intimates that, doesn't it? And but you can see what's happening here is you have a shape, and then you have it subdivided. And you have it subdivided fairly early. But so in the planes, I'll clarify this in a little bit later, but you can see that the plane, this is a plane taken from the side. If my arm is up here, you could say this line here describes one plane that's sitting down here. But when you start modeling it, you'll see that there are value units. This cheek here, for example, that forms a plane, and it differentiates from other planes, and that's in the same as a three-dimensional sense of a cube or a piece of wooden, carving, in which you chop off those things. And I think of it that way. Now you don't have to. I haven't got myself complicatedly into working this way. I must prefer the other way, because this way seems to have an awful lot of complication awfully soon, and the other way has less. So you're not looking for a whole bunch of planes on the forehead. You're actually articulating a roundness. On the other hand, when you're trying to really refine a roundness, even there in your mind, you'll have to analyze certain areas of that roundness and note what the angle is in some segment of it, and that's planar in itself, if you want to put it that way. But so we have the face planes, the angles under, and all these things as if they were chopped out, and I think of that as planar. And if you wanted to just put it that way, I'd put it to you with the two models right in front of us. There's an angle and these smooth round things, big eggs, and there's this model here, which is Harold Speed's planar mentality. And that shows up here on my case, the interpretation I've showed you before of this head, that was basically an egg with color movements in it. They got a little refined, but I'm not cutting out great planar stuff. On the other hand, I suggest to you that this head, the hair by Sorolla here, and we talked about this before in the same way, is built out of planes, out of square cornered, again, that chiseled look, right? So that's a planar mindset. You're seeing, he's thinking of the egg as if it was a series of planes, okay? And it's, crudely speaking, it's not, both of these are crude, by the way. The head is far more than an egg. And the roundness of the head can't really be described in planes without it becoming a deformed roundness. So in either case, these are strategies for beginning pictures more than anything else. And I've just always found that the assessment of the great tube and the great egg is a simpler way. In our case, because it enables me to handle color in a simplified field, and especially on the skull, so you can see color movements in that head. It doesn't mean that as you move along, there aren't planes. Sometimes there are things that actually look strikingly like planes, that some of this begins to do that. Well, this obviously could be thought of as a totally separate plane, and even sections over here are these value units. But I've never found a reason to make extra edges. So this is me talking about how I think about it. I don't really want a bunch of extra edges that then I have to think about and work on. I'd rather have a great simplistic head and put in those corners when I want them, right? Bring it to the planes. And I find that retains unity greater for me than the other way. Now this is the Bridgman model, and this is really a totally straightforward amplification of that discussion. But you can see that he's treating the whole head as if it was a cube, which by itself is a planar mentality, right? It's great chopped planes. And then you can see that the angles all going all around this thing, these are a series of straight things, which I think of as planes. I think that's what they're doing in the side view of this thing. They're chopping off as if they were carving it. Plane, plane, plane. There's always this mentality associated with it. Again, the plane is an important thing. Not the mentality of three-dimensionality and all sorts of stuff, but the idea of shifts and angles and knowing what angle that section of it actually has. So when you're talking about a section of an arc, it really matters. I'm suggesting that I haven't found it more beneficial. I find you do have to have that skill incorporated into your round making on any curve. You have to be able to assess a segment of that curve and get the angle of that segment to whatever degree it has an angle. And I shouldn't say that incorrectly. If it's a perfect arc, then that's a different story, right? But if it's a piece of an arc, which is typically what a skull is, there's a piece of an arc that goes a little bit, bends a little bit, so you can see where that little arc that's truly a piece of a radius, an arc is a segment of the radius. That little piece, to the extent that before it starts shifting, it has a certain segment that's that length and it'll have a tilt to it. And that's what I think of as the planar value. And so as you go around the head, you'll have other segments that are more or less like one section might have a whole piece like a watermelon, segment of a watermelon, and to the degree that you can see that as a unity, you can get the angle of it, right? But I've never found it desirable to do this thing with the angle chopping right away, the planar creation. I find it's a whole bunch of junk that you have to get rid of, but this is just me, nothing you have to bother your pretty little heads about. Now this is an example of an Ang drawing, and it's just setting side by side with one of the Bargue plates. And there's no question that there is that discussion about the Bargue. The Bargue was creating these plates in concert with Jerome. So as I said again, it's possible that Ang is talking about not drawing from the planes, and he may be referring to Jerome, a person he knew well, and to what even might have been happening here. But I want to put something before you just as we say that. The idea of drawing from the planes indicates there's an early phase of the drawing, right? And so he wants the early phase to be for the ball and the arc and the and the, what would you say, the simplified form, the rounds. Now you could argue that he's also saying draw the rounds, draw the arcs, and not the angles. Don't chop a bunch of straight lines on it, because nature really isn't like that, especially if you're talking about the figure, which he probably dominatingly was. So though it has angles, you can see even by the time the Bargue foot is done later on that there's a sense of the round incorporated. One of the things you find with whatever method you start out with using either of these, is you'll wind up with a heavy-handedness of it, if you want to put that. At the end, you'll have the burden of the method you start with. It's always going to be the case, however you work, right? So it is with the angle stuff, but it doesn't mean you won't get further and further from that as you evolve. Naturally, a guy with doing the round is going to get more, so we say, corneriness. More of the reeds on the where the planes bone up, make their shifts more suddenly. You're going to get that. But your first form would have been the egg. So you, at the end of the day, will have more of a sense of roundness, sort of as the burden that you're sort of seeking to escape from, where the guy that comes in with all these angles is going to be seeking to get to the unity of the roundness. And I just personally have found it considerably simpler to think about the great forms first and not make them out of 1,000 little, or some number of little ones. But yeah, and one of the things that's characteristic, as I said again, you look at these feet by Ang, and you can see the tubularity. It's just very strikingly there, right? Very, very, very impressively there. And you could say this isn't quite the same setting, although the hand over here is similar, but the lighting is from the side, so it is somewhat similar. But this one has, it seems to me, a greater burden of angles. And by the way, with an ankle, that might be great. And that brings up another question about when a certain way of working might be more appropriate. But it's what I've said before, though, about the great angles. Like if you're hacking in a head, no matter which way you're doing it, you've got to get the great angle relationships of whatever points there are out there. Those angles have to be right. I've just never found it necessary or desirable to go around hacking them all in like a crutch, and then trying to connect the dots. I actually take great pleasure in running a curve and then going back and analyzing it where it's broken, where it's inadequate. And yeah. Actually, I think I brought this Degas in here. I want to suggest to you, and I could have brought others in. I actually forgot completely to bring in anything from Sargent. And I'm not even sure. I mean, looking at Sargent, I think he's a pretty mixed bag of stuff, but there does seem to be a striking planarness, and I think it's because of I'm not going to say why, but I'm not sure what that quote was. I'm not sure what you were getting that from, so I would have to have looked at that, Jovan, to be clear in using Sargent. I'm not going to talk about him because I have no pictures to show you. But I wanted just to look at the general sense of this, and this is what you'll find fairly characteristic in the nudes and the dancers. And that is, if you look at the legs, what you're seeing is the tubes. You're seeing the drawing of the Raphael mentality, or certainly the Ag mentality about the tubularity as being the dominant form. And back to that question of why make it out of three little forms when you can make it just as well out of one big one. Well, of course, these aren't three little forms. This is a multiplicity of things, but the forms are the big ones. And I think Degas, following Ang, and he was an astute what shall we say, attendee to the thoughts of Ang. I think he is living on Ang's thinking here as well as finding it for himself. And by the way, I don't think any of us really, if you're trying to be a good painter, you don't really live in somebody else's head. You can't know what's in their head in the first place. You're constantly reviewing nature itself and finding, when somebody says something, you say, well, is that true? Is that going to provide me with something that I'm basically missing in my interpretation of nature? And you'll be looking for a cost benefit. And if you're like me, no matter what I was taught, I would try the other thing. I just did it routinely. So I just found that I begin to know better and better what in the heck I was doing by doing what was the other. For example, I took an example from the drawings of Fetchin, which I rather admired, where we'd been taught to draw outlines, find the shadow line, and turn the form. It was a whole internal process. And Degas says practically the same thing as his drawing is what happens between the outlines. But what he was doing, I found, though, is he was blowing on form, and the lines were after frequently. So there's beautifully articulated lines on a blooming form in the work of Fetchin. You might have a look at it. But that's the mentality of trying it this way, trying it that way. Whatever way you're working, I suggest you try it the other way to see what the benefits are, and then build in as you find your own better, if you want to say theory, drawing theory or whatever. Okay, Jovan, I think I've done it. Let's just glance slowly back through these things. If there's anything I happen to think of, you can see what he's done on the nose of this one down here. You see how he's created a plane, now he's created as if a carved out flat unit, like it was chunked out of wood. And so you could argue maybe that's sort of, you wonder if you aren't going to wind up with a certain woodenness on account of that. I have, yeah. The second part of this is I'm not particularly a fan of anything that looks like a constructed thing when you're painting. I prefer to have it look as much like nature. My methodology incorporate the look of nature as it can, rather than having this whole formulaic thing. It's much the same in my mind as doing a grisaille. I don't really want a grisaille. I don't want a gray study. I want all the color too. And I'm saying I'm looking for a model rather at the beginning that incorporates that, rather than making a whole angular thing that's not true. Why wouldn't I use curves and get the angles right? Because it's more true right from the beginning. Well, it's the kind of discussion I have with myself. I don't like work to look like method. I like it to look like nature, and I just like it to look like it's growing out of nature, which I perceive as something what people talk about Sargent that he's doing as well. So I hope you can grasp that. The one on the left is Sorolla, for whatever this is worth. That element of woodenness, I think, is what goes with the territory of planar work and planar thinking. And then you get to people like Kikoshka, and that's just the crazy things they do. I mean, I find them staggeringly unpleasant, I guess is the right word. I wouldn't find it so. I don't find the Bridgmans unpleasant, when you're looking at those hacked out things. I find it's kind of fascinating. They do feel like wood, but I don't find that difficult. I've always loved wood carving, so I don't find that difficult. But there it is again. So you should be able to just grasp in just a blink that the look is different. Now you could say that the angular approach would maybe fit a male head better. Of a certain age where the boniness and stuff is there, when you're looking at a very feminine woman who isn't bony, soft, gentle curves and all that sorts of define her. Would you do it a different way? There's no reason for me to tell you something different. As I said, the only reason I'm doing what I do is because I don't like that level of complexity right from the beginning. I prefer to come from simple and go to complex, and to the degree you need complexity, get it. And I find that applies to everything in our way of painting. What's not to love? Anybody get a chance to see that the Fornarina as Raphael and the Fornarina? That's one of the most beautiful paintings, and to me, it rather embodies the surface beauty and color pleasantness. Color sanity and aesthetic, and so many things, including incorporating a sense of the souls, and then of course the situation. where Raphael's got his girlfriend on his lap, he can't get his eyes off his picture of her. Maybe. All right, I think we're all set. So thank you very much, and Jovan, for that question, and we'll see you all in the next one.